Uma produção WGBH Boston associada a Harvard University. Qual a coisa certa a fazer? Justice, com Michael Sandel.
We ended last time with that remarkable poll. Do you remember? The poll about birth order. What percentage of people in this room raised their hands? Was it to say that they were the firstborn? 75, 80%? And what was the significance of that if you're thinking about these theories of distributive justice? Remember, we were discussing three different theories of distributive justice, three different ways of answering the question, how should income and wealth and opportunities and the good things in life be distributed? And so far, we've looked at the libertarian answer that says the just system of distribution is a system of free exchange, a free market economy, against a background of formal equality, which simply means that jobs and careers are open to anyone. Rawls says this represents an improvement over aristocratic and caste systems because everyone can compete for every job, careers open to talents. And beyond that, the just distribution is the one that results from free exchange, voluntary transactions. No more, no less. Then Rawls argues, if all you have is formal equality, jobs open to everyone, the result is not going to be fair. It will be biased in favor of those who happen to be born to affluent families, who happen to have the benefit of good educational opportunities. And that accident of birth is not a just basis for distributing life chances. And so many people who notice this unfairness, Rawls argues, are led to embrace a system of fair equality of opportunity. That leads to the meritocratic system. Fair equality of opportunity. But Rawls says, even if you bring everyone to the same starting point in the race, what's going to happen? Who's going to win? The fastest runners. So once you're troubled by basing distributive shares on morally arbitrary contingencies, you should, if you reason it through, be carried all the way to what Rawls calls the democratic conception, a more egalitarian conception of distributive justice that he defines by the difference principle. Now, he doesn't say that the only way to remedy or to compensate for differences in natural talents and abilities is to have a kind of leveling equality, a guaranteed equality of outcome. But he does say there's another way to deal with these contingencies. People may gain, may benefit from their good fortune, but only on terms that work to the advantage of the least well-off. And so we can test how this theory actually works by thinking about some pay differentials that arise in our society. What does the average school teacher make in the United States, do you suppose? Roughly. It's a little more, 42,000. What about David Letterman? How much do you think David Letterman makes? More than a school teacher? $31 million. David Letterman. Is that fair? That David Letterman makes that much more than a school teacher? Well, Rawls's answer would be, it depends whether the basic structure of society is designed in such a way that Letterman's $31 million is subject to taxation so that some of those earnings are taken to work for the advantage of the least well-off. One other example of a pay differential. A justice of the United States Supreme Court. What do they make? It's just under $200,000. Here's Sandra Day O'Connor, for example. There she is. But there's another judge who makes a lot more than Sandra Day O'Connor. Do you know who it is? Judge Judy. How did you know that? You watch? You know, but you've heard. You're right. Judge Judy, you know how much she makes? There she is. $25 million. Now, is that just? Is it fair? Well, the answer is it depends whether this is against a background system in line with the difference principle, where those who come out on top in terms of income and wealth are taxed in a way that benefits the least well-off members of society. Now, we're going to come back to these wage differentials, pay differentials, between a real judge and a TV judge, the one Marcus watches all the time. What I want to do now is return to these theories and to examine the objections to Rawls's more egalitarian theory, the difference principle. There are at least 3 objections to Rawls's difference principle. One of them came up last time in the discussion, and a number of you raised this worry. What about incentives? Isn't there the risk if taxes reach 70, 80, 90% marginal rate that Michael Jordan won't play basketball, that David Letterman won't do late-night comedy, or that CEOs will go into some other line of work? Now, who among those who are defenders of Rawls, who has an answer to this objection about the need for incentives? Yes, go ahead, stand up.
Rawls's idea is that there should only be so much difference that it helps the least well-off the most. So if there's too much equality, then the least well-off might not be able to watch late-night TV or might not have a job because their CEO doesn't want to work. So you need to find the correct balance where taxation still leaves enough incentive for the least well-off to benefit from the talents.
Good. And what's your name?
Tim.
Tim. All right. So Tim is saying, in effect, that Rawls takes account of incentives and could allow for pay differentials and for some adjustment in the tax rate to take account of incentives. But, Tim points out, the standpoint from which the question of incentives needs to be considered is not the effect on the total size of the economic pie, but instead from the standpoint of the effect of incentives or disincentives on the well-being of those at the bottom. Right? Good, thank you. I think that is what Rawls would say. In fact, if you look in section 17, where he describes the difference principle, he allows for incentives. The naturally advantaged are not to gain merely because they are more gifted, but only to cover the costs of training and education and for using their endowments in ways that help the less fortunate as well. So you can have incentives. You can adjust the tax rate if taking too much from David Letterman or from Michael Jordan or from Bill Gates winds up actually hurting those at the bottom. That's the test. So incentives, that's not a decisive objection against Rawls's difference principle. But there are two weightier, more difficult objections. One of them comes from defenders of a meritocratic conception. The argument that says, what about effort? What about people working hard, having a right to what they earn because they've deserved it, they've worked hard for it? That's the objection from effort and moral desert. Then there's another objection that comes from libertarians, and this objection has to do with reasserting the idea of self-ownership. Doesn't the difference principle, by treating our natural talents and endowments as common assets, doesn't that violate the idea that we own ourselves? Now, let me deal first with the objection that comes from the libertarian direction. Milton Friedman writes in his book, Free to Choose, life is not fair. And it's tempting to believe that government can rectify what nature has spawned. But his answer is, the only way to try to rectify that is to have a leveling equality of outcome, everyone finishing the race at the same point, and that would be a disaster. This is an easy argument to answer, and Rawls addresses it in one of the most powerful passages, I think, of A Theory of Justice. It's in section 17. The natural distribution, and here he's talking about the natural distribution of talents and endowments, is neither just nor unjust. Nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. That's his answer to libertarian laissez-faire economists like Milton Friedman, who say life is unfair, but get over it. Get over it, and let's see if we can at least maximize the benefits that flow from it. But the more powerful libertarian objection to Rawls is not from the libertarian economists like Milton Friedman. It's from the argument about self-ownership, developed, as we saw, in Nozick. And from that point of view, yes, it might be a good thing to create Head Start programs and public schools so that everyone can go to a decent school and start the race at the same starting line. That might be good. But if you tax people to create public schools, if you tax people against their will, you coerce them. It's a form of theft. If you take some of Letterman's 31 million, tax it away to support public schools against his will, the state is really doing no better than stealing from him. It's coercion. And the reason is, we have to think of ourselves as owning our talents and endowments, because otherwise we're back to just using people and coercing people. That's the libertarian reply. What's Rawls' answer to that objection? He doesn't address the idea of self-ownership directly. But the effect, the moral weight of his argument for the difference principle is maybe we don't own ourselves in that thoroughgoing sense after all. Now, he says this doesn't mean that the state is an owner in me in the sense that it can simply commandeer my life. Because remember, the first principle we would agree to behind the veil of ignorance is the principle of equal basic liberties: freedom of speech, religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and the like. So the only respect in which the idea of self-ownership must give way comes when we're thinking about whether I own myself in the sense that I have a privileged claim on the benefits that come from the exercise of my talents in a market economy. And Rawls says, on reflection, we don't. We can defend rights. We can respect the individual. We can uphold human dignity without embracing the idea of self-possession. That, in effect, is his reply to the libertarian. I want to turn now to his reply to the defender of a meritocratic conception, who invokes effort as the basis of moral desert. People who work hard to develop their talents deserve the benefits that come from the exercise of their talents. Well, we've already seen the beginning of Rawls's answer to that question, and it goes back to that poll we took about birth order. His first answer is, even the work ethic, even the willingness to strive conscientiously, depends on all sorts of family circumstances and social and cultural contingencies for which we can claim no credit. You can't claim credit for the fact that most of us, happen to be first in birth order, and that for some complex psychological and social reasons, that seems to be associated with striving, with achieving, with effort. That's one answer. There's a second answer. Those of you who invoke effort, you don't really believe that moral desert attaches to effort. Take two construction workers. One is strong and can raise 4 walls in an hour without even breaking a sweat. And another construction worker is small and scrawny and has to spend 3 days to do the same amount of work. No defender of meritocracy is going to look at the effort of that weak and scrawny construction worker and say, therefore, he deserves to make more. So it isn't really effort. This is the second reply to the meritocratic claim. It isn't really effort that the defender of meritocracy believes is the moral basis of distributive shares. It's contribution. How much do you contribute? But contribution takes us straight back to our natural talents and abilities, not just effort. And it's not our doing how we came into the possession of those talents in the first place. All right, suppose you accepted these arguments, that effort isn't everything, that contribution matters from the standpoint of the meritocratic conception, that effort even isn't our own doing. Does that mean, the objection continues, does that mean that according to Rawls, moral desert has nothing to do with distributive justice? Well, yes. Distributive justice is not about moral desert. Now, here, Rawls introduces an important and a tricky distinction. It's between moral desert on the one hand and entitlements to legitimate expectations on the other. What is the difference between moral deserts and entitlements? Consider two different games, a game of chance and a game of skill. Take a game of pure chance. Say I play the Massachusetts State Lottery, and my number comes up. I'm entitled to my winnings. But even though I'm entitled to my winnings, there's no sense in which, because it's just a game of luck, no sense in which I morally deserve to win in the first place. That's an entitlement. Now contrast the lottery with a different kind of game, a game of skill. Now, imagine the Boston Red Sox winning the World Series. When they win, they're entitled to the trophy, but it can be always asked of a game of skill, did they deserve to win? It's always possible, in principle, to distinguish what someone's entitled to under the rules and whether they deserve to win in the first place. That's an antecedent standard, moral desert. Now, Rawls says distributive justice is not a matter of moral desert, though it is a matter of entitlements to legitimate expectations. Here's where he explains it. A just scheme answers to what men are entitled to. It satisfies their legitimate expectations, is founded upon social institutions. But what they are entitled to is not proportional to, nor dependent on, their intrinsic worth. The principles of justice that regulate the basic structure do not mention moral desert, and there is no tendency for distributive shares to correspond to it. Why does Rawls make this distinction? What morally is at stake? One thing morally at stake is the whole question of effort that we've already discussed. But there's a second contingency, a second source of moral arbitrariness that goes beyond the question of whether it's to my credit that I have the talents that enable me to get ahead. And that has to do with the contingency that I live in a society that happens to prize my talents. The fact that David Letterman lives in a society that puts a great premium, puts a great value on a certain type of smirky joke, that's not his doing. He's lucky that he happens to live in such a society. But this is a second contingency. This isn't something that we can claim credit for. Even if I had sole, unproblematic claim to my talents and to my effort, it would still be the case that the benefits I get from exercising those talents depend on factors that are arbitrary from a moral point of view. What my talents will reap in a market economy, what does that depend on? What other people happen to want or like in this society. It depends on the law of supply and demand. That's not my doing. Certainly not the basis for moral desert. What counts as contributing depends on the qualities that this or that society happens to prize. Most of us are fortunate to possess, in large measure, for whatever reason, the qualities that our society happens to prize. The qualities that enable us to provide what society wants. In a capitalist society, it helps to have entrepreneurial drive. In a bureaucratic society, it helps to get on easily and smoothly with superiors. In a mass democratic society, it helps to look good on television and to speak in short, superficial sound bites. In a litigious society, it helps to go to law school and to have the talents to do well on LSATs. But none of this is our doing. Suppose that we, with our talents, inhabited not our society, technologically advanced, highly litigious, but a hunting society or a warrior society. What would become of our talents then? They wouldn't get us very far. No doubt some of us would develop others. But would we be less worthy? Would we be less virtuous? Would we be less meritorious if we lived in that kind of society rather than in ours? Rawls's answer is no. We might make less money, and properly so. But while we would be entitled to less, we would be no less worthy, no less deserving than we are now. And here's the point: the same could be said of those in our society who happen to hold less prestigious positions, who happen to have fewer of the talents that our society happens to reward. So here's the moral import of the distinction between moral desert and entitlements to legitimate expectations. We are entitled to the benefits that the rules of the game promise for the exercise of our talents. But it's a mistake and a conceit to suppose that we deserve in the first place a society that values the qualities we happen to have in abundance. Now, we've been talking here about income and wealth. What about opportunities and honors? What about the distribution of access, of seats in elite colleges and universities? It's true. All of you, most of you firstborn, worked hard, strived, developed your talents to get here. But Rawls asks, in effect, what is the moral status of your claim to the benefits that attach to the opportunities you have? Are seats in colleges and universities a matter, a kind of reward, an honor for those who deserve them because they've worked so hard? Or are those seats, those opportunities and honors, entitlements to legitimate expectations that depend for their justification on those of us who enjoy them, doing so in a way that works to the benefit of those at the bottom of society? That's the question that Rawls's difference principle poses. It's a question that can be asked of the earnings of Michael Jordan and David Letterman and Judge Judy, but it's also a question that can be asked of opportunities to go to the top colleges and universities. And that's a debate that comes out when we turn to the question of affirmative action next time.